most people think they have to add their way to 10x.
Mm, yeah.
And I used to, that's where I went wrong in the past. I used to think growth was about building more products, more channels, more initiatives. But that just, right, that creates even more complexity, and that actually kills scale. So the fastest way to grow is actually to eliminate, what should you eliminate in your product so you can focus on what's truly 10x?
Hey, welcome to the Rare Mind Podcast, a new thing where I, Alex M.H. Smith, the author of No Bullshit Strategy, explore the outlier behaviors that produce outlier results. I mean, look, in this world that we're living in where every idiot is getting ChatGPT to tell them what to do, this is the stuff that matters more than ever. And in this episode, I'm going to speak to a guy who is probably the global authority on what makes for a great CEO. So if that's something that you would like to be, then this is something that you need to listen to. I hope you enjoy. All right, today with me here on the Rare Mind Podcast, I have a friend, client, and, well, surely must be getting on for someone who is the biggest person in the world on LinkedIn. I haven't done the stats on that, but it certainly appears that way to me. It is Eric Partaker, the CEO coach, who not only now is like the global authority pretty much on CEOs and what it takes to be a great CEO, but I mean, you've had many different careers. You're sort of like a business Arnold Schwarzenegger, thriving in different fields. For example, being the founder and CEO of Chilango, which was a Mexican chain that I used to enjoy frequenting back in my youthful London days. And you've worked at great companies like Skype and McKinsey and stuff like that. So yes, I think that if anyone's got good insights into strategic thinking and what it takes to build a business, there aren't many people better than you. So thanks a lot for joining me here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex. And it's hard to have any issue with being described the Arnold Schwarzenegger of business. That sounds pretty cool.
You could keep that one. I mean, I've been trying to get people to describe me that way for years, and it never sticks. So I'll just give it to you. That's
Yeah,
fine.
no, I mean, I've it's funny too though when you say that, because if I were to go back and time machine or whatever to my college or university days, and if my future self would have told me then, right, 18 years old, 19 years old or whatever, that life would have unfolded this way, I would have thought it was just ludicrous, right? Because as you said, I started my career late 90s in consulting at McKinsey, then did some nonprofit for a while. That was part of the early team at Skype. We had a big exit to eBay like 20 years ago, which was life-changing. And then built a chain of Mexican restaurants, like you were saying. I mean, so very, very random. And then after that, about 5 years ago or so, started to invest, coach, mentor, advise founders and CEOs, essentially just helping them scale their businesses, but to do it, more efficiently and more rapidly.
It's almost tricky for me because the theme of one of the main things I want to discuss here on the podcast is when speaking to very successful people like yourself, generally speaking, there will be something that they can look back on as a breakthrough moment. And I'm interested in those breakthrough moments and then the odd differentiated thing that you did to trigger that, because I'm sort of working on the principle of, to get outlier results, you have to do first some kind of outlier behavior, and it's those outlier behaviors which are interesting. However, in your case, because you've had all these different careers, each of which have presumably had their own breakthrough moments, there probably isn't one thing that stands out. But I suppose if you,
There is
oh, there
actually.
is. Oh, okay, great. So yeah, what was the moment when, I mean, not to
Well,
put too fine a
no,
point on it,
yeah,
it all worked.
yeah. Sorry. So there is. Okay. So let me just clarify. There is there's almost like a first principles meta fundamental approach that created the breakthroughs in all of the moments. Um,
Right.
and actually, I think that is a little bit more interesting. And then I can talk, a little bit more like micro in terms of the latest breakthrough, unique to what I'm currently doing right now. But I
Mhm.
actually think it's a much cooler place to start to think about, well, what is the more fundamental thing? Because that's the thing that I think is actually timeless.
Yes.
Um, whereas LinkedIn is a platform. Yeah, that
Yeah,
is
exactly.
definitely not timeless, right? So that's just like a thing in society at the moment. Um, yeah, so I actually first wrote about this meta principle 6 years ago in my book, The Three Alarms. And in that book, I talked about how massive goals creates massive results. And talked about how when you set a massive goal, it changes the structure of the problem itself, and it leads to you doing things that you wouldn't have done or considered had you not set that goal. As simple as that sounds. And it may sound like common sense, but unfortunately, common sense isn't always common practice. And so I wrote about how that manifested for me from the late '90s, all the way up until the book was written, which is in 2020. And it's a combination of two things. So the first thing is you have to set a massive goal, which I refer to as 10x goals, a 10x goal. And I mean, gosh, this it has to be 10x, right? It's like if I would say that it's all about setting a 9x or an 11x goal, like you think something's wrong, right? So it has to be a 10x goal. Um, and um, and so that's the critical thing. You must set a 10x goal um, that you're not even maybe necessarily sure how you will achieve. And then your path to achievement is 80/20. So 10x goal and then 80/20 to achieve it. And that has I've run that like playbook multiple times. So let me just give you some. Is it okay if I give you some quick stories to illustrate?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so late '90s, I'm at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the U.S.
Oh, I
Um,
went there. That's crazy.
oh yeah, wait, you weren't there as an undergrad though, were you? Or
I was there for
when were
1
you
year as an undergrad in
as an
2007.
undergrad? Yes. Okay. So I was there. That is crazy. Okay. So I was there 99. Yeah. Look, I mean, it's a good school. It's a solid school. It is not an Ivy League school. And not only is it not an Ivy League school, but um, I didn't even like do my absolute best that I could do when I was there. The first year I had to drop out because I realized I was going to fail all of my classes, and so I would rather have like a W withdraw on my on my transcript than an F. And then the second year I came back and it was still like mediocre performance. Everything changed only because I got a 10x goal in mind. So I was sitting in an management and organizational behavior class. And the only reason I took that class was because the class was being taught by a professor from Stanford University who was kind of like on loan at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign for a while. And so I had just thought to myself, well, I'll never, get the chance to be taught by somebody like this. So this is like an incredible opportunity. That's the only reason I took the class. And so I'm sitting in the class, and lo and behold, after a few lectures or whatever, I'm not really paying attention as I did in so many other classes. And then all of a sudden, I hear him say, if anybody in the room were to get a job at the company I'm going to profile next, I'd fall out of my chair. And that caught my attention. I've always been attracted to kind of like
That's
10x
a good
thinking,
ad
10x
pitch.
goal, right? So that was like he was speaking in outlier language to me.
Hmm.
And then he profiled this company, McKinsey and Company, which I knew nothing about. From that moment, Alex, I had a 10x goal. So what happened? I had, virtually Fs withdrew before they registered, basically Cs and Bs in my classes. From that point on, I took 33 additional courses to graduate. Because I wanted to get into McKinsey, I ended up getting 31 As and 2 Bs out of those 33 final courses. So it changed the way I was showing up because I knew how hard it was going to be to achieve that goal. I practiced relentlessly. Again, what you have to do, relentless and outlier are like two words that must go together. On this case interview style method that they use to evaluate candidates. And long story short, I ended up landing, the roles. So there was 2,000 applicants for 22 roles. 20 of the 22 roles went to Ivy League graduates, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, that sort of thing. And I was one of two, that got a chance, to start my career at McKinsey. So that hooked me from that moment. I realized that if you have a 10x outcome that you're trying to achieve, that it changes the structure of the problem itself. It changed the way I practice. It changed the way I showed up. It led to me identifying what are the 20% of the things that I could do that increase lead to 80% of the probability of me being hired. And for me, that 80/20 was absolutely crushed on the grades. From here on out, getting as close to a 4.0, near perfect as possible. And then absolutely crush it on the preparation for the specific style of interviewing that they do. So I knew 10x and 80/20 as a combo was a thing. At Skype, I'll give you two more stories. So at Skype, it was a 10x outcome that we were going for from day one. So the tagline for the company was "The whole world can talk for free." So it was literally world domination, day one, 10x outcome, let's go. And that led to, once again, an 80/20 approach. So what did we do? So we focused on natural virality and then massive distribution. So natural virality, what did we do? So we had this thing inside the company. I mean, it wasn't ever externally talked about, but the software always had to be so easy to use that any grandmother on the planet could use this piece of software. Like that was the rule. And so the usability was like flawless in terms of ease, and it was just easy to use. It took off. That was on the virality side. And then on the distribution side, and this is one of the things that I focused on in business development at the company, was just cutting up the world into the major, markets, and then identifying who is the biggest ISP, internet service provider, by market, and then let's bundle our software together with theirs and piggyback off of their distribution. Again, we wouldn't have pursued those massive kind of levers had the goal not been also massive as well. And then implicit in all of this is when you pursue 80/20 as your means of achievement. And a lot of people don't get this, and this is where they screw up. For example, most CEOs don't have a growth problem. They have a focus problem. So the 80/20 rule says you focus on 20% of the things that will deliver 80% of the outcome that you're seeking. So the inverse of that is that you are saying no to cutting out and eliminating the other 80% of things, right? That where your time could go because you believe it will only deliver a 20% additional outcome. When people pursue the 80/20 rule, they have to get like both sides of that equation, right? So I'm going to pursue this 20% for the 80%, and I'm absolutely not going to touch, and I'm going to cut out, and I'm going to eliminate, and I'm going to ruthlessly deprioritize this other 80%. And that's like a segue to a final story I'll give you with LinkedIn, because you're talking about breakthrough moments. So again, the meta principle is you must choose a 10x goal. You use 80/20 as the path to achievement. So LinkedIn. So I went from, in a 2-year and 3-month period, from 20,000 followers to 1 million, having not posted anything before. And the breakthrough moment for that was because I realized I was trying to do lots of different social channels at once. And so I wasn't actually following 80/20 rule. And so I said, look, I have to remove almost everything. So instead of like trying to grow from doing like lots of things better, no, I'm going to do fewer things that like matter exponentially, more. And again, every single goal that I've achieved is like choosing a bigger goal, cutting the distractions, and then you focus relentlessly on this one path. And at that time, what I realized was that I was spending too much of my time on the supply side of the equation, basic economics, supply and demand. And I said, well, hang on, instead of trying to figure out how to supply at scale, what if I just focus exclusively on demand for now and figure out how to just completely crush demand? And that led me to say, look, I'm going to stop all of my efforts on all of the channels. I'm going to focus exclusively on LinkedIn. And I was putting in, at the beginning, I put in anywhere from 30 to 40 hours per week on it myself. And I just did that relentlessly for months and months and months until I cracked it. And then, here we are. So I think breakthroughs actually come from imbalance rather than balance. They come from, you must have a 10x goal. You must figure out the 80/20 path to achieve. And you actually have to be prepared to literally cut everything else, whether that's a person, a process, another project or initiative that isn't on your quickest route to achievement, if you get what I mean.
Amazing stuff. There's so much I can pick up on there, but the funniest thing, the most curious thing, is that I flippantly described you as the Arnold Schwarzenegger of business in the intro. And actually, what you're talking about completely aligns with something that I've written about a few times. What you call 10x goals, I quite literally call, weirdly, Schwarzenegger goals, because because if you look back, for example, like what the inverse thing that people do, which I think is the opposite of the 10x, the opposite of the Schwarzenegger goal, is that people tend to set goals which are pretty achievable. Like, let's, for sake of argument, let's grow sales by 15-20%. And then because those goals are achievable, they do quite dull, mundane, boring, optimization focused stuff. And maybe they hit them, but they never actually do anything that sort of takes them out of their comfort zone and into a sort of differentiated space. So the reason I tie it to Schwarzenegger is if you look back at like when he was just a farm boy in Graz, he said, right, I want to become the world's #1 bodybuilder. And the leap from being where he was starting to that was so big that like the question wasn't would he or would he not achieve it? Because maybe these 10x goals we don't actually achieve, but I don't think achieving them is really the point. The point, as you said, is that because the goal is so big, it leads you on a very differentiated, aggressive, interesting path. And you're going to enjoy the journey. You're going to learn stuff. You're going to do interesting stuff just trying to get there. Because by definition, you have to, if you don't know how to reach the goal, you have to move beyond your current set of frameworks and parameters. And I think that this is the problem that you see with a lot of people in their lives, and then obviously in business as well, that people only pick things essentially that they know how to do. They only pick things that are within their current frame of reference, which of course, by definition, is going to box you in. And then with regards to your sort of your imbalance point, which I love, I mean, would you agree, this has been always my observation, that the problem that I see for most founders and CEOs with their strategy, I often say that the sort of the bad form of strategy, which most businesses employ, and it sort of to an extent works fine for a lot of them, but it's still like not the optimal, is what I would call optimization based strategy. So they essentially look at the whole business, and they look at each one of the different things in the business, like you got your sales, your marketing, your hiring, whatever they might be. And the attitude is, right, how can we improve each one of these things and do them the best that we can? Let's improve each one of these things 10%. And the CEO's behavior becomes essentially this. Fundamentally, it's just management, where they're saying they're always looking at how can we make everything that we do be that little bit better. And their strategy, quote unquote, for the following year might be, here's what we're going to do in sales, here's what we're going to do in marketing, here's what we're going to do to product to try and improve all of these things. Having spoken to a lot more CEOs than me, would you agree that that is the kind of the default behavior, which is different to what you're describing?
Yeah. So what I see, I mean, basically what we're talking about here is real strategy work. And the way I would think about what you're just referring to now is that most CEOs, they confuse activity with strategy. So they're incredibly busy, but they're not really making strategic decisions. And like I was talking about with the 80/20 rule, when you use that as one of your strategic tools, because of the nature of the rule, what's the 20% that you will do for 80% gain? What's the 80% you won't do because it only provides marginal 20% gain? So if you're doing 20 and then not doing 80, then really, if you think about it from like a, mind share point of view, real strategy actually is more about deciding what you're not going to be doing. And that ends up being uncomfortable because people, I think human nature, it's like we want to have lots of options. We want to place a lot of bets. And what I'm talking about, and I know you're a big believer of this as well, is that, no, you have to make the trade-offs, right? And most CEOs, they'll still be emotionally attached to parts of their business that maybe are no longer serving the future or this like 10x goal. And so then they lack, you know, what, yeah, what has been my signature like lens or whatever, right? Which is if you haven't defined a future big enough, it's not going to force real strategy. And then if your goal is um, optimization, like you were saying, well, optimization, you can optimize anything endlessly. So then, therefore, it allows you to keep everything. But again, if your goal is to, if your goal is to hit a 10x goal, or as you said, like an Arnold Schwarzenegger goal, then you're actually forced to eliminate like 80, 90% of what you're doing. And then if you think about that, if you connect all that together, the 10x forces the clarity, forces elimination, and then therefore you get to real strategy. And so I'd say the difference between average, because I have, I helped over 600 businesses now scale, and the difference between average versus elite is that once that setup is made, right? So 10x goal, what's the 80-20 path, to get there? Then, and this is where it goes wrong potentially again. So the best CEOs will think in terms of theory of constraints. They'll think in terms of constraint, not effort, basically. So for example, like an average CEO might ask, like, okay, so we have this goal, like, how do we grow our way to this? A great CEO will say, no. What's the single biggest constraint that's holding growth back right now? And then how do we remove that constraint? So the coaching that I practice when it comes to like scale is basically constraint. I call it constraint-led coaching. So it's and I have a very simple framework that I use for this, because I equate strategy to metaphorically to flight. And so I say, look, your plane's in the air. It has an altitude right now. But if we want to 10x it, its altitude, it means relatively speaking, it's flying low right now. That's risky. You can hit something, you have lower recovery time if something doesn't go right. So how do we 10x its altitude? Physics of flight. We need to increase lift, reduce drag, generate thrust. Or in other words, we need to elevate, eliminate, and execute. And so once you have that lens of your 10x goal, it's easier for you to figure out, okay, well, what in the company do I need to elevate within leadership, within myself? What do I need to eliminate? What's creating drag? And then therefore, with the capacity that I create through elevating and eliminating, where will I focus? What will I execute?
Quickly, if you're enjoying this and you want to get the full thinking blueprint that sits under basically all of these ideas, then you're going to want to grab a copy of my book, No Bullshit Strategy. I'd like to say that you can pick it up wherever you get your books, but let's be real, you're probably just going to go to Amazon, and that is all fine because it is on there too, obviously. Two of my favourite reviews are one where a professor from USC said that she'd made it required reading for all of her students, quite right too, and another where a guy called it a spiritual masterpiece masquerading as a book on strategy. Now that is obviously the kind of praise I'm here for, so if you're curious what the hell he was on about, then go and check it out.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess the other angle on it as well, I think, is that you talked about the 10x giving clarity, which it does. I would probably even go further and say, I think that the benefit of the 10x is that it forces creativity, because basically, that the current things that you're thinking of, you just know for a fact that they're not going to work. Well, probably some people are delusional and they do think that they can tweak their way to 10x. But broadly speaking, as soon as you accept that the status quo of the business is not going to get you there, that is a hugely freeing moment where you then have to actually start like sourcing different and new ideas. I mean, you also see another guy. I guess another way of thinking about it is that I sort of equate every business to an animal, and like, there's, depending on what the animal is, it's going to grow to the optimal size for what that animal should be. So a mouse is the size of a mouse, because if a mouse was the size of a cat, it wouldn't work, right? So it stops growing at a certain point. And to me, like, any business conceptually is going to be the same thing. It will naturally grow to the size of what your current concept of that business has outlined it to be. And then when it hits that point, it cannot grow any further. And there's nothing you can do to make it grow other than to stretch the metaphor, changing what the animal is. So if you change from a mouse to a cat, then the business will start growing again. But that does require a completely different sort of understanding of what the business is. And as you say, with the 10x goals, that's where you suddenly wake up overnight, I think, and you think to yourself, oh, right, well, yeah, this business as it is, it can never be 10x what it is now, as without some fundamental, like, complete conceptual change. And then you're actually starting
Completely.
to think strategically, and it's just sort of flicking that switch in your brain that forces you to think strategically. That is the switch that most founders, they just never flick, because they're plenty, as you said, they're plenty busy enough with all of the other stuff. So you can just, like, happily, merrily continue for 20 years without ever flicking that switch.
Yeah, 100%. If like I can give you another quick story to illustrate. Um, so if let's say you're coaching a founder, and let's say that she does $1 million a year in sales, and she wants to get it to she wants to grow at 10% to 1.1 million, and you say to her, okay, well, how do you make your sales today? They're founder led. She's on the phone. Okay, well, how are you going to get to 1.1 million? I'll add an extra hour to the day. Yeah, I'll make more calls, and that could work. And she could probably come up with 19 other ways to add, an extra 100K. But if instead you said, no, you have to go from 1 million to 10 million, now her brain breaks, because now there's not enough hours in the day. So now she has to think, to your
Yeah.
point, completely differently, creatively. And your changing of the animal, for me, I just, referred to that as the redesign of the business model. So like a true
Mm.
10x goal will force some kind of business model reimagination or redesign. And I just think a business model is super simple as product, market, and delivery. And you'll have to change one or more of those in order to 10x. And I see this all the time, and usually it's voiced with frustration. So I'll be mentoring or coaching a CEO, or one of the CEOs that. So even recently, we in our 10x program, one of the CEOs said in one of the calls, he's like, "Yeah, but this isn't going to work. This isn't going to scale." And I said, "Exactly." And this, as in what you're doing today, this won't scale. There's no chance in hell it will get to 10x. I mean, that's why you're in the program, because if it could be at 10x already, I guess you wouldn't be here. So yeah, this isn't going to scale, right? So bingo, you're onto something. And this means, well, your current product, like, take it to its fullest potential. Like, maybe that could get to 3x. The market that you're serving, all these low value clients that have like high cost to serve, are they going to take you to 10x? No. But maybe some of those enterprise deals that you've been thinking about, or those strategic, distribution, partnerships, they could take you to 10x. Delivery. Well, like, if it's the founder delivering everything, is that going to take you to 10x? Hell no. So yeah, when the business, and you're in the animal language, a mouse will only grow to a mouse. Yes, because the mouse is effectively the business model. And unless you change the animal, change the business model in terms of product, market, and or delivery, it will ultimately be, constrained. And but once people realize that, and also too, once you realize that, hey, look, you can do whatever you want, because what you're currently doing didn't even exist before, and you just did what you wanted to get there. So you can also do what you want again, and create something completely new that has more scale potential.
I guess I've always thought that the reason that people don't make that very obvious leap in their minds is because there's a natural tendency that if I've created a business and for sake of argument, it's grown to 5 million fairly sort of organically, then I could be pretty proud of that. And I can think, wow, what a smart guy I am. I've managed to create this idea that has grown this business to 5 million. And of course, if I just keep on pushing, it's going to grow to it's going to grow to 10 million. So your success of the past, I suppose it's that classic, what got you here won't get you there. But that isn't how people think. People actually quite the opposite. I think they very naturally think what got me here by definition will get me there because look, it's already got me here. And of course, people are very
Yeah.
bad at sort of like ambiguous. We see this fallacy so often with statistics and stuff. You know, it's the classic like my puppy has doubled in size in the first 6 months of its life. Imagine how big it's going to be when it's 5 years old, which of course like is a stupid keep on with these animal analogies. But people sort of like fall into that trap all the time. They rate their prior decisions essentially sort of like too highly, and then they just extrapolate it out. And then when that business hits that inevitable growth plateau, like they'll experience it as frustration. Like, I don't understand why this isn't working anymore. I know that this works because it's been proven to work in the past. Why isn't it working now? But like you say, you've just reached that invisible maturity threshold, and
Yeah.
it's completely natural.
And
Uh,
implicit
mm,
in doing that work that we're talking about, like for example, changing the business model, figuring out how to scale, is that people typically find that they're going to subtract their way to 10x. So most people think they have to add their way to 10x.
yeah.
And I used to, that's where I went wrong in the past. I used to think growth was about building more and more products, more channels, more initiatives. And but that just right, that creates even more complexity and that actually kills scale. So the fastest way to grow is actually to eliminate, what should you eliminate in your product so you can focus on what's truly 10x? Who should you eliminate within your people so you can focus on, on the true 10x people? Your market as well. What channels are just not worth the effort versus the ones that are. And the biggest gains I've seen, personally, right, and all the 10x outcomes I've achieved with 600 plus, CEOs, it actually comes from, I'd say it comes more from removing things that shouldn't exist in the business and subtracting your way to 10x rather than trying to add your way.
I should probably take that advice myself. I'm conscious. I'm conscious. There's one thing that I really wanted to cover before we finish up, and that is, uh, I'm not one of these people who believes that like things are always changing or change is moving faster than ever. Blah blah blah. I think historically there are very long periods where not much changes at all. That being said, in the last 6 months, I feel like everybody has experienced some sort of vibe shift. There's a lot of anxiety out there. There's a lot of uneasiness. People really feel the ground moving underneath their feet. A big part of this is clearly driven by AI, but I suppose there's other macroeconomic stuff as well. Is there anything that you personally having to adapt to changes that are happening in the world right now, or and if so, how, or are you feeling? Are you not feeling that sense of uneasiness and being tipped off balance? Or maybe it's what you observe in your clients as well, of course.
No, I mean, I'm doubling down on simplicity, right? So there's more information than ever, with more tools than ever. And I think in a way, CEOs are probably maybe more overwhelmed, right, than ever. So what I'm doing with our own business, our own proposition, is just really focusing on helping people cut through all of that. More than ever, people need, they don't need more frameworks. I think they need better filters to separate signal from noise.
Yes.
Um, and so, and this is central to, exactly how we help CEOs 10x is, if I had to say it in very, very simple terms, we give CEOs clarity and like a filtration system, a way to very clearly say, yeah, that's interesting, but I'm not going to do all of that or spend my time on any of that. This is where I'm focusing. And I think it's just essential because my God, it's like the rate of change, the pace of change. It is, I mean, we are literally sitting in the most exponential part of the curve ever in the history of time. So it's crazy.
And the there's a huge problem as well, I think, connected to what you're saying, a problem of abundance as I see it. I think that this is literally the last year or so. I think it's the first time in human history where things in all sorts of domains have been tipping over to a problem of oversupply rather than undersupply. I don't think that most business people have woken up to this at all. One very obvious example of this, which was a kind of a canary in the coal mine, which I think proves your point, is what's happened to the music industry in recent times, where, in short, basically, because there's so much bloody music and it's all available at the click of a button on Spotify, you think, what effect does this have on that industry? And the answer is that the proportion of old music that people are listening to is increasing and the proportion of new music is decreasing, because people are basically saying in their head, I can't be asked to look through all this stuff. I'm just going to listen to the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin or whatever they're into, because it is, as you say, it's a response to the overwhelm. They are actually doing the filtration on themselves, and the new
Yes.
music is not being discovered. Now, what I think people need to think about is that this same pattern is actually happening in all sorts of business domains as well, where when people get to a state of overwhelm, it's like, right, whatever the most straightforward, discoverable, obvious thing is, I'll just do that. And it might not even be the right thing or the best thing, but I'm just gonna do that. And I think that has a really big effect on how businesses will think about strategy and how they prioritize. But nobody's really, I think, fully clocking onto this at the moment.
Beautiful. We're very aligned.
So,
Very aligned.
Eric, look, lots of CEOs and founders will be listening to this, and I think that your knowledge is stuff they need to hear. So, what's the destination that they should go to get
Oh
cracking
yeah,
with that?
just if you're looking to scale whatever you're doing rapidly, yeah, we can help you. Just head over to my website at ericpartaker.com, and you can connect there.
And best of all, if you go on one of Eric's programs, I do a little module on there. So, like, what a double whammy bonus that would be.
Exactly. Awesome.
Cheers, mate. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks a ton.
Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to keep expanding the way that you think and the results that you get, then make sure you hit subscribe here. And also check out basicarts.org/raremind, where you can subscribe to my Substack, which features deep essays on these topics, deep practical essays, and fundamentally is all about how businesses can win in this crazy post-AI world.